Hello, students. In this chapter, we are going into a little bit further into the New Kingdom. This is New Kingdom Part 2, and we're going into a period of Egyptian history known as the Amarna period, and also, as you might have guessed from the title, the Great Heresy. This is also a time of great controversy in Egypt's history, in that some people disagree about what exactly the pharaoh who has come to be known as Akhenaten did, and whether it was for his own devices, for his own well-being and purposes, or if he truly was on a religious mission and if he truly had a religious vision. So let us begin. So, Amenhotep III, we saw in chapter 8, was succeeded by his son, who was also called Amenhotep IV, to be precise. And the two kings might have served in a co-regency for a time, but scholars disagree about the length of that time, and some people say 2 years, some say up to 11. Our book argues for the brief co-regency theory, assuming that for most of his 17-year reign, Akhenaten, as he came to be known, ruled independently from his father. And there's a lot of theories about this. As you can see from this slide, we have the beautiful face of Queen Nefertiti, who many would argue is the most beautiful woman in all of art history. She was Akhenaten's wife. We also have Moses, and some people believe that Moses might have been influenced by Akhenaten or vice versa. So here we go. So at the beginning of his reign, Amenhotep IV continued his father's building projects and his emphasis on the sun god, if you will recall. And he gave prominence to the solar deity Ra-Harakti, who is traditionally depicted in human form with a falcon head. And I've just included this walking coat because, well, I think it's beautiful, and it bears the face of Akhenaten on it. So here's what happened. He began to introduce and expand the name for the sun god, that may be translated Ra-Harakti, who rejoices on the horizon in his name of light, which is the sun disk Aten. And herein begins our story. When a short form of this name was needed, because it could be long, the deity was referred to as Aten, the sun disk with whom Amenhotep III had already identified himself. The long name was soon divided and placed into two royal cartouches, emphasizing a kingly dimension of the god. Next, a completely new divine image was introduced. The falcon-headed human image was abandoned and replaced by a non-anthropomorphic representation of the sun disk with rays ending in hands. And you can see that here, actually. We'll see this slide again, and I'll explain it in more detail, but here is the sun disk. And then if you look down at the end of the rays of the sun, you can see that there are hands there. So we'll come back to this image. And here you can see it again. In accordance with 18th dynasty solar religion, the Aten was both the creator and the sustainer of his creation. The divine and royal deity with his name in paired cartouches also celebrated said festivals. The king was the child and the image of the Aten, his high priest and representative on earth, who also had his own high priest to minister to the cult of his divine aspect. And he and his principal wife, Nefertiti, represented the generative force of the male and female principles of the universe that had been separated out from the androgynous creator at the time of creation. And religious texts relating to the Aten are concerned with the life-giving aspects of the deity as he traveled across the daytime sky. Actually, the traditional journey through the underworld at night is ignored, and it's unclear what form of afterlife the Aten theology offered, but what's interesting is the funerary tradition of symbolism that relates to Osiris and the underworld mostly disappeared during this time. So Amenhotep IV, his name means Amen is pleased, and he changed his name to Akhenaten, which means servant of the Aten. So he essentially starts to wipe out everything that had gone before. So at first, he attempted to establish a cult of Aten in the historic centers of Egypt, like Thebes, and he built a vast temple complex there to the east of the main temple precinct. But Thebes was very closely linked to Amun-Ra. Remember from the last chapter, Amun-Ra's priesthood had become more powerful and more wealthy, and so other cities were also closely linked with their own deities. So the king decided to build an entirely new city dedicated to the Aten. And he selected an uninhabited desert site on the east bank of the Nile in Middle Egypt, situated in a great bay in the cliffs. And he called the place Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, perhaps in part because the shape of the eastern cliffs was such that when the sun rose over them, the combination resembled the hieroglyph for horizon. And today the site is called Amarna, and that's where this period takes its name. This period is known as the Amarna Kingdom, or the Amarna period. And what you see in this slide is a reconstruction of the city of Amarna, and we'll see why it no longer exists in some future slides. So here we go. So the move to Akhenaten, as he called the city, began in the year 5, and he set up dated boundary stelae marking out the territory of his chosen site. And it's around this time that he changed his name, as I mentioned, from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. And the cult of the Aten left no place for other deities, so basically they were mostly neglected. But sometime we see after the year 9, the cult of Amun-Ra was actually actively attacked, and the name and image of the god removed from the monuments. And also around year 9, the long name of the Aten was changed to eliminate the reference to Horus in Herakti, so that the name instead began Ra, ruler of the double horizon. So what does all this mean? Well, some people think, we'll get to the human figure in a second, some people think that Akhenaten was a true mystic and that he truly believed in this new religion that he was spreading. And others more cynically believe that he was actually trying to usurp the power of the priests of Amun-Ra and their wealth as well, because they had just become too powerful and too wealthy. He wrote a lot of hymns to the Aten, however, which kind of suggests he was a true religious mystic, that he truly had something going on there. So I will leave it to you to decide. A lot of Egyptians believe that Akhenaten was in fact Moses. The timeline doesn't quite add up exactly right, but it's an interesting theory in any case. So what we're going to talk about, however, and focus on is what happened to the art during this period, and specifically to the way the human figure is shown. And by looking at these two depictions of the king, you can already see there's something interesting going on. It looks radically different from traditional Egyptian art, and this is in the proportion of the human figure, and especially with the king. So the head is very large, with drooping features and a long neck. The shoulders and the waist are narrow, so that the upper torso is small, and then below the waist, the body swells out to form large buttocks and curvaceous thighs. He looks kind of womanly from the waist down, and his belly even droops over the sagging waistband of his kilt, and the arms and lower legs are thin and lack any musculature. And the whys and wherefores of this are many. Some think that because the Aten was kind of a, I don't want to say a bisexual figure, because not so much bisexual as he was more hermaphroditic. He combined both male and female. He, generated the universe completely in and of himself. So some people think that Akhenaten was trying to portray himself as both male and female. Some people think it's because he suffered from a congenital problem with his spine, which would have caused a curvature, which would have caused his belly to protrude. We really don't know. There's nothing to tell us specifically why. All we have is the evidence that we can see in the art. So later in his reign, the form of the body became less extreme, The shoulders and the waist tend to be slightly wider, the small of the back is lowered, so the acute contrast between the tiny upper torso and the enlarged buttocks and thigh region is somewhat mitigated. It's not quite as major. The other thing that we see with Akhenaten that we don't see in other pharaohs is that stop it. I'm sorry, I had to yell at my cat. The one thing we see with him that we don't see in other pharaohs is that he portrays himself as a family man, which we don't see that with any other pharaohs. Here he is, this is Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and here are 3 of the 6 daughters that they would eventually have together. And so that's very unusual. We have a lot of images of him playing with his daughters, holding them on his lap, and we don't see that anywhere else in Egyptian art or history. And as I said, there's no texts to explain why these changes were made, but they must have been maybe instigated or at least approved by the king. And because the new royal image coincided with the preeminence given to the Ya-10, the whole thing was probably much in the same way that Hatshepsut was using art to show herself in a particular way. This new image was probably designed to make a religious statement. Interestingly, you can see this is Akhenaten here. He's still got his arms in what's known as the Osiris pose, where they're crossed over his chest with the crook, shepherd's crook, and the flail. So he did maintain that look at least. So many of the proportions, as I said, they give a rather feminine appearance to the figure, the slenderness of the torso, high small of the back, etc., etc. And since the king was the manifestation of the Ya-10 on earth, and the Ya-10 as creator was androgynous, as I mentioned, he might have intended that the image has both male and female characteristics. And in addition, the Ya-10 brought abundance and prosperity to the land, and these are concepts traditionally associated with Hapi, who was the god of the Nile and the Nile inundation, the flood. And Hapi was traditionally shown, as you can see on the right here, as a fat fecundity figure. He always has a belly. So texts also identify Akhenaten with Hapi, and his corpulence, fatness, may be meant to display this aspect of the king. This supposition is strengthened by an extraordinary detail that occurs in rendering the rendering of the king's thighs and genital region. So, traditionally, figures of the king and elite males wear opaque kilts that show nothing underneath, and by contrast, most two-dimensional figures of Akhenaten show the forward line of his near thigh beneath his kilt as it runs upward to meet the stomach. And there's no genitals visible there, which, normally you would see that. And this recalls the way in which fecundity figures are depicted. And like Akhenaten, they too show no genitalia, and maybe that's meant to enhance the notion that they're so fat that the folds of their stomach droop so low that the genitals are concealed. Kind of gross. So, although the king's figure is feminized, it's still distinct from female figures. The most obvious difference, apart from the clothes, is in the genital region. Female dress is treated as transparent, so the body is visible underneath, including the stomach, the thighs, and the pubic triangle. And the configuration of this area is totally different from the king's figure. And the display of the female body was not new in Egyptian art because the tight sheath dress that outlined the shape of the body naturally drew attention to the pubic region. Its purpose was probably to produce an icon of female fertility. And at Amarna, it was particularly appropriate to Nefertiti's image since she represented the new female principle. And what we also see in the Amarna period is the importance of Nefertiti. Suddenly we're seeing the queen equal to the king. So we'll get to that. But the new rendering of the royal figure influenced the representation of non-royal people so that they too have narrow shoulders, slender limbs, short lower legs, drooping stomachs, and pronounced buttocks. Their figures, however, are generalized imitations. They're not exact copies of the king, And they're less extreme. They don't have the king's same drooping facial features. I don't know if I would call it drooping like your book does. I would say it's more long, elongated. And further, in two-dimensional art, a deliberate distinction is made between the rendering of royal and non-royal feet, interestingly, of all things. The near and far feet of royal figures during the Amarna period are differentiated, but non-royal figures are depicted with both feet shown from the inside. So, looking at the royal funerary complex of the king during this period, he excavated his rock-cut tomb deep in a wadi that ran back into the eastern cliffs of Akhetaten in a series of stairs and corridors that led downwards to the burial chamber. And although the architecture was not dissimilar to previous royal tombs, the decoration, which we have only in fragmentary form, differed completely. The journey of the sun and the underworld and scenes of the king with funerary deities were inappropriate for the Aten religion. As I said, they really didn't make any references to what happens in the afterlife. It almost seems as though they're saying, unless you're the king, you got no afterlife. So I'm sure that did not go over well with the Egyptians and was not popular. And indeed, we'll see with subsequent chapters that after this period, they went back to their polytheistic ways and also, having very detailed references to what happens in the afterlife. So instead, during this period, the ritual offering scenes were substituted, showing the king, the queen, and royal children worshiping the Aten. And in addition, one scene in the burial chamber showed the king and queen, followed by the royal daughters, offering to the Aten before a shrine containing the standing figure of a royal woman, perhaps Akhenaten's mother Tai. And behind the royal family were several registers of mourners. And then there's a second very fragmentary scene that seems to show another scene of mourning and perhaps the funeral of the king. And a lot of these sites are very badly damaged, again, because Akhetaten was abandoned after this period, and a lot of things were actually destroyed because, as I said, the Egyptians really objected to this worldview. And then two subsidiary tombs led off the main royal tomb. One consisting of a series of corridors and rooms was unfinished and undecorated and might have been intended for Nefertiti. And the other comprised a group of 3 rooms with decorations in the first and third. The first contained 2 ritual scenes that showed the adoration of the rising and setting sun by the royal family, Egyptians and foreigners. As the sun rises, the birds and the animals of the desert wake and greet the deity. And then there's a separate scene of mourning, which seems to show the death of a royal woman in childbirth. The third room is concerned with the death in childbirth of the king's daughter, Merkataten, showing her being mourned by the royal family and the court, and this was surely where the princess herself was buried. And the main tomb was almost certainly used for the burial of Akhenaten, but it was spoiled in antiquity and his body destroyed or removed. And actually, since the publication of your book, his body has been identified, and they've been able to do DNA tests on it to prove that he, in fact, is the father of Tutankhamun, and so forth and so on. So if you're interested, follow that link right there. In any case, as I also mentioned, as we've seen, lots of things smashed because the Egyptians weren't happy, so his sarcophagus was smashed to pieces, but there's enough fragments that remain to give us an idea of the decoration, and instead of the traditional texts and representations of funerary deities, each side showed a large image of the Aten with the disc centered at the top and the rays streaming down below, each holding an ankh with the promise of life for the king. And then at the corners, usually you'd have Isis and Nephthys at the corners, but now we have figures of Nefertiti instead, with her arms spread in the same gesture that Nephthys and Isis would have. And the presence of the Aten in the decoration signified that the life-giving rays of the sun penetrated even into the tomb. So, yay, the king gets to have an afterlife. It's too bad for everybody else. So, What you're looking at here are some blocks of a material known as talatat, which is actually from an Arabic term referring to the dimensions that were used in the building projects of Akhenaten's state temples and some other things. And as I said, a lot of the buildings were dismantled, knocked down, and so forth. But they've also been able to recover some of them. A lot of them were used in other building projects. But looking at the fragments, we might be able to get some understanding of Akhenaten's decorative program. And further excavations have recovered the foundations of part of a colonnaded court and a number of colossal statues of the king, like this one, that once stood in front of the pillars. And this one is badly damaged too, as you can see. And the interior walls of the colonnade were decorated with painted relief scenes showing the king celebrating a Sed festival, which was unusual early in a reign. But it was also celebrated by the Aten, which is, again, another departure from tradition because deities were the givers of the Sed festival to the king, not the recipients. So the ancient ceremony is adapted in Akhenaten's time to this new concept of Aten as the divine king. And the buildings at Karnak introduce the ubiquitous ritual offering scene that we have in temples, palaces, on royal tombs, and on stelae throughout Akhenaten's reign. Here we have the king below the sun disk making offerings, and the queen is behind him, very nice and small. And there's also an ankh being held to his nose, and also one to the queen as well. And the scene takes place instead of the traditional scenes in a temple where the king would be embraced by the deity and would be handed the ox sign or some other symbol of kingly insignia. And in such scenes, the king and the deity are on equal footing, but Akhenaten's shifted everything completely. So now the sun disk is at the top of the scene, presumably as the sun is in the sky, with the figure of the king below. So the Aten has the primary position. And then the human king, because of his size, he's bigger than everybody. So he dominates by virtue of the fact that he is the largest. So he's actually still the focal point of the composition rather than the sun. And then when the queen is also present, she's almost always drawn on a smaller scale. And then as you can see here, the children are smaller still. And the members of the royal family are often positioned so that the descending heights of their heads form an oblique line that is echoing the oblique lines of the Aten rays. And only the foundations of the temples at Amarna remain, but some details can be added from the representations in non-royal tomb chapels. So the Great Temple was an enormous enclosure, 229 by 730 meters, in which only 2 buildings seemed to be completed. And at the front of the enclosure was the House of Rejoicing, entered through a pylon into a pillared hall that led to a series of open courts with offering tables. And as in all solar temples, there were no enclosed sanctuaries for the divine cult statue. Instead, altars performing the offering rites stood under the open sky with the overhead sun as the cult image. Rather than having a picture there, you've actually got the sun. And in one tomb scene, which we can see on this slide, there's a round top stone on a pedestal that is depicted standing in a temple enclosure, and that's the Benben stone, which is the sacred solar symbol of Heliopolis. And there were no actual statues of the Aten, but evidence from tomb statues and fragmentary remains show that the large numbers of statues of the king and also the queen were placed in the temple, and indeed statues of the royal family were ubiquitous, in other words, everywhere throughout the city. And instead of cult statues of the Aten, Akhenaten himself was the living manifestation of the deity, and the city was deliberately laid out to provide a setting for his display. And a broad road about 30 meters wide ran from the palace on the north edge of the city where the king dealt with the business of government. And in non-royal tomb scenes, the king is shown riding the road in his chariot, as you can see right here, escorted by running soldiers, and everyone along the way is bowing low with their arms raised in adoration as he passes. So even if he is, a true mystic, he is also kind of venerating himself quite a bit. So you can imagine in the morning how Akhenaten might appear in his chariot and make his progress south to attend to his ritual and government duties, and then return along the same route in the evening in a cycle as regular as that of the sun disk traveling across the sky. And these royal processions were meant to give an opportunity for the inhabitants of the city to adore and acclaim the living manifestation of the Aten, as they had previously adored and acclaimed the cult statues that were carried in procession. And the administrative palace was the setting for and the appointing of and rewarding officials. So scenes in non-royal tombs don't show these occasions taking place in the throne room as they would have in earlier dynasties, but instead at a window of appearance. So that's what this is right here, a window of appearance, where we've got the Aten up here, we've got Akhenaten and Nefertiti together, and basically they are leaning down towards the officials standing below. And this shows basically excuse me, that the wall was painted with figures of bound foreigners, and the window would have been set in the wall above and looked out over the palace courtyard where the official and his entourage would have assembled for the ceremony. And I actually need to stop for a moment. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'll get the hang of this yet. Let's go from the current slide. So here we have a close-up of the scene of the window, and it's an open shrine-like feature, which has friezes of Uriae, and it's admitting the sun's rays on the king and the queen. And these three images represent the triad of Creator and his first creations, the male and female principles of the universe. And then this triad is also the focus of veneration on stelae that were set up in people's private gardens and their household shrines. And figures of some of the royal children were usually included, maybe to symbolize the interaction of the two principles and the continued existence of the created world. So here, Nefertiti has a daughter on her lap, and Akhenaten is holding one of their daughters. And it's interesting, they don't look like babies. As you can see, they look like miniature adults. And in addition to the stelae, the shrines could contain small statues of the king. This was the best picture I could find of one of those, which is actually out of your book. And the walls of the shrine would be decorated with versions of the usual standard ritual scene showing the king and his family making offerings to the Aten. And the cult images found in these shrines show that Akhenaten and his family were objects of veneration for the elite, and that's also indicated by texts that address prayers to the king and queen, again suggesting that the couple acted as intermediaries between the rest of humanity and the Aten. So now we'll look at some non-royal tombs. And the tombs of the elite officials of Akhenaten were cut into the eastern cliffs north and south of the entrance to the royal wadi. And the chapels of the bigger tombs consisted of an outer room leading to an inner room with a large statue niche in the form of a shrine in the center of the back wall, as you can see here. And then smaller chapels had only one room and a statue niche. And here the decoration shows a complete change from traditional chapels. Those everyday life scenes, the fishing, the hunting, the banqueting, are gone. Instead, we have the king offering to the Aten, riding his chariot through the city, eating and drinking in the palace, or rewarding the tomb owner from his window of appearance, and that's replaced the kiosk scene. And at first sight, scenes relating to the burial and funerary ritual of the deceased appear to have vanished also, but it seems that these were probably confined to the statue shrine, which was left undecorated in most tombs. In the tomb of Huya, who was steward of the king's mother, the two side walls of the shrine show the rites performed over the coffin and groups of male and female mourners and the bringing of food offerings and funerary items. And this is the shrine in the tomb of Panezi, who was the first servant of the Aten in the house of the Aten at Akhetaten. And it was decorated with the traditional scene of the deceased and his wife before a table of offerings with a male figure performing the offering rites. And similar offering scenes also appear on the walls of a shrine in the tomb of a scribe known as Eni. And the traditional nature of these scenes is not matched by the texts, since traditional funerary formulae were not appropriate to the Aten religion. Generally, the inscriptions invoke the Aten and the king, but maybe for the deceased, this was a way for their families to kind of, maybe assure something in the afterlife. I'm guessing here. And few non-royal stelae were found at Amarna, and this may be in part because of the type of scene showing an individual adoring a deity could not be used, since only the king and queen and his family could actually adore the Aten directly. So statues of non-royal individuals are extremely rare in contrast to the countless sculptures of the king and his family that would have been erected in the temples, palaces, and even private homes of Amarna. The dominant position given to the king and his family in tomb chapels and the lack of other non-royal monuments just demonstrate this overwhelming emphasis placed on the depiction of the king and the relative marginalization of images of the elite. So we don't know how Akhenaten's reign ended. One of the things about Egyptian history is they never write about the death of the king explicitly, so we don't really know. We do know that his ultimate successor was the famous Tutankhamun. Tutankhamun came to the throne as a young boy and reigned for 10 years, and a block originally from Amarna named Tutankhamun, a block originally from Amarna shows us that Tutankhamun was originally named Tutankhaten, and it gives him the title King Sons of his Body, so he was the offspring of Akhenaten, and DNA tests on the mummies, as I said, they found Akhenaten's mummy, and were able to compare his DNA to that of Tutankhamun, so we know he definitely was the father of Tutankhamun. And the first year or so of his reign was spent at Amarna. But not before long, he went back to Memphis. And at the same time, the Aten theology ceased to be exclusive and the traditional cults to the gods were restored. They abandoned any unfinished building projects from Akhenaten's reign, and new projects were instituted in state temples throughout Egypt and Nubia, and the divine images destroyed by Akhenaten were replaced with new statues. And it's hard for us to appreciate his restoration program because his reliefs and statues were usurped by his successors, often, as I say, the Ramesside kings of the 19th dynasty, with this simple expedience of replacing their names with, or his name with theirs. So it's hard to know for sure. But it is clear that the walls of Amenhotep III's colonnade at Luxor were at this time decorated with scenes of the Opet festival, and figures of the king and deity are drawn in accordance with traditional proportions, so that the height of the lower leg is once again a third of the hairline height. However, in the scenes showing the procession of the sacred boats, the Amarna influence is still strong. And we know Tutankhamun, he was actually, would have been considered probably a very minor king because he only ruled for 10 years. He came to the throne at 10 years of age, but his burial was hidden for years because of the way that the Nile flooded. It caused things to be covered up and hidden. So it wasn't discovered until 1922, and it was pretty much intact. There were a couple things that would have been raided possibly by the very builders of his tomb. And because he died young and unexpectedly, his tomb is small, and it consists of a stairway and a corridor leading to 4 rooms. And it's very different from earlier 18th dynasty tombs. So what we kind of believe is that his tomb was not ready when he died, and a more nearly finished non-royal tomb was used instead. And this is Howard Carter, the discoverer of Tutankhamun's tomb, with the mummy as, they're uncovering it from the sarcophagus. So the painted decoration in the burial chamber must have been applied between the time of his death and burial. And usually, with the pharaoh, upon his birth, they would start, preparing his tomb. So by looking at the incredible riches from King Tut's tomb, we can kind of get an idea of what it must have been like to have a complete burial. It must have been just unbelievably full of riches. So although the decoration here is very abbreviated, it's very traditional. Instead of the whole journey of the sun through the underworld, the west wall has a version of the first hour of the night. On the south wall and part of the north, the king is shown with various deities. And however, on the east wall, there's a group of officials depicted dragging the dead king in a sarcophagus as part of his funeral procession. And on the adjacent east end of the north wall, Tutankhamun's successor, King I, and that's what we're looking at here, King I is performing the opening of the mouth ritual, which is where the mummy's mouth is ceremonially opened so that he can breathe in the afterlife. So these scenes remind us that the very fragmentary scene in the burial chamber might depict his funeral, but they don't have a precedent in earlier tombs in the Valley of the Kings. And the figures of the king and deities still show some Amarna influence. Here you can see there's a bit of belly there. And it's curious that the figures on the south wall exhibit lower legs with a length 1/3 of the hairline height. And this can only mean that different artists work on the north and south wall, the former still using modified Amarna proportions and the latter returning to traditional proportions. And this is another shot, a black and white shot from 1922 of the tomb as they saw it when they first walked in. And as I said, it showed the astonishing wealth and variety of royal paraphernalia. So there's some items such as the funerary masks, coffins, shrines, canopic equipment, and divine and royal statues were made specifically for burial. Their purpose being to protect the dead king and aid his transformation into the next life. And then other objects like items of furniture, clothing, writing equipment, ceremonial sticks, fans, and chariots would have been actually used by the king while he was alive. And many of these were decorated motifs that show him triumphant over foreigners. Bound prisoners adorn his footstools and sandals, placing them literally under the king's feet. And the handles of his ceremonial sticks, where the king would grab them with his fist, and the panels of his chariots show the vehicle of royal display of aggression. And this is a small painted chest that has 4 scenes of the king in his chariot on its long sides and its lid. And the composition is the same in all of them. The king in his chariot dominates the scene, and he's charging against the forces of chaos, which in this case are Nubians and Syrians on the side, and then desert animals on the lid. And then behind the king, much smaller figures of Egyptian chariotry and infantry are neatly arranged in 3 registers. So again, forces of order, neat, nice and neat, 3 registers, forces of chaos, all over the place. So these scenes encapsulate the Egyptian world vision that contrasts the ordered world with the surrounding chaos of the desert and foreign lands, and also puts the king once again at the center of the struggle to maintain order in the face of chaos. And I'm sure the Egyptians were very pleased to have their order restored back to the way things were after Akhenaten's reign. So, as I said, after Tutankhamun, and we don't know for sure how Tutankhamun died, there's been a lot of speculation about that. It's now believed that he might have died of sepsis, that he had a wound in his leg that became infected. And back then they did not have means of dealing with that. So in any case, I came after Tut, and then after that, Tutankhamun's top general Horemheb became king, and Horemheb completed the return to orthodoxy. He also began the dismantling of all the Aten temples and the restoration of damage done to the Amun temples during the reign of Akhenaten. And he also usurped most of the monuments of his two predecessors. And interestingly, the reigns of Akhenaten and his immediate successors were expunged from the records, and Horemheb added their regnal years in addition to his own. Nice, huh? In his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, there is a curious holdover from the Amarna period, and the subject matter is perfectly orthodox, depicting the king with various deities and the sun's journey through the underworld, but the proportions retain the short lower leg from Amarna. And since the short lower leg is not found on other royal monuments, it seems that the artists who decorated the tombs, by retaining this one Amarna characteristic, were departing from the mainstream of artistic practice. So now we'll look at some non-royal tombs at Saqqara. And for most of the 18th dynasty, the best evidence for non-royal tombs comes from Thebes, although some officials were also buried at Saqqara in rock-cut tombs. And after the Amarna period, tombs of a different design appear at Saqqara, and their chapels are freestanding and consist of an entrance into an open court leading to 3 shrines for the funerary cult. Depending on the wealth of the owner, the layout could be expanded by adding another court or more rooms and increasing the numbers of statues and stelae in the building. The basic plan of these chapels resembles a small temple with a pylon and open court leading to the ritual inner part of the building. It is possible that their inspiration came from royal funerary temples. And in the late 18th dynasty, the main building material for these tomb chapels was mud brick with the addition of stone elements, such as doorways and stelae. The walls of important rooms, such as the main chapel, were lined with blocks of limestone into which they cut relief scenes. And in less important areas like the side chapels and the statue rooms, which had vaulted ceilings, the mud brick walls were simply plastered and then painted on top with just flat paint. And today, little of this painted plaster has survived, and it's only in recent excavations that its use in New Kingdom chapels at Saqqara has been discovered. And while still a private person, Horemheb, before he became royal, built a tomb for himself at Saqqara in the reign of Tutankhamun, and it is the finest and best preserved of such tombs so far excavated, and it underwent several changes and planned to enlarge it, no doubt, as Horemheb became more popular and as his star rose. And some of the decoration was traditional, but a lot of the scenes reflect his military career and show rows of subdued northern and southern prisoners. And a group of foreign rulers actually grovel as they are presented by Horemheb to the king and the queen at the window of appearance, while elsewhere prisoners are brought to the royal couple and thrown in a kiosk. And in these scenes, Horemheb is clearly acting as the agent of the king, but in another scene, prisoners are presented to Horemheb himself, not the king. And since the subjection of prisoners was the ritual duty of the king, Horemheb actually is coming close to usurping a royal prerogative and might be expressing his own aspirations to power. So kind of an interesting thing about what Horemheb's role might have been at the court of Tutankhamun. And Horemheb actually never used this tomb himself because he eventually became king. What you can see in this illustration is that later on, a little royal uraeus was added to his figures after he became king. And the non-royal figures in this and other Memphite tombs have some traits in common with the Amarna figures, but they don't have the short lower leg. Male figures exhibit narrow shoulders, a high small of the back, slender limbs, no musculature, and such proportions produce a small upper torso and a long part of the lower part of the body, and they do give an overall impression of elegance, and that is also enhanced by the elaborately draped and tied costume that adds a rather dandified effect. And representations of the kings and deities are more traditional in their proportions, with wide shoulders and a lower small of the back. So, a conclusion to our Amarna period here. Sometimes it's classified as naturalistic because people think that Akhenaten was actually trying to get his artists to depict him as he really looked. Again, we don't really know for sure, but I don't know, you know, of too many people that really look that way, and it's doubtful whether any of the categories that have been devised for the artistic styles of other cultures can be applied to the art of ancient Egypt. Maybe we would say it's more expressionistic or mannerist for those of you who are familiar with those periods, exaggerated poses and things like that. So although we might not ever know the underlying reasons for changes in the proportions of the human figure at this time, it seems more plausible to attribute them to Akhenaten's religious convictions rather than to see them as reflecting, as some people have said, a diseased condition like scoliosis or something like that suffered by the king. And there's certainly no reason to suppose that art under Akhenaten became any more realistic than it had been traditionally. And after Akhenaten's death, religious orthodoxy returned, and with it a more traditional rendering of bodily proportions, especially in figures and of deities and the king. Nevertheless, the Amarna influence was not totally erased, and non-royal figures in the private tombs at Saqqara retained the high small of the back and slender limbs of Amarna figures, although the short leg was abandoned, not only in the immediate post-Amarna period, but throughout the rest of the New Kingdom, which we will see in chapter 9, or chapter 10, yes, and that will conclude the New Kingdom after chapter 10. And your book doesn't talk a lot about Queen Nefertiti, but I do want to talk about the statue in this slide of her. It's a bust, which means it's her head and shoulders basically, and it's very unique in Egyptian history, and I think it's because of this statue that they often say that the art of the Amarna period was naturalistic, which I don't think you can base all of that on one sculpture. But you definitely get the feeling of a likeness in the way that she's got little dimples at the corners of her mouth. It gives her a very distinct look. You get the feeling of muscles and bone structure underneath the skin, so it certainly feels more realistic than other things of that time. And also this unique crown that Nefertiti seems to have worn, unique to any other Egyptian queens throughout Egyptian history. And as I've said, some people believe that she might have been co-regent along with Akhenaten. So this is something that if you are interested, you could definitely write about Nefertiti for your final paper, because it is your choice, and how she was depicted, and maybe explore why people think that she is the most beautiful woman in art history. So I am concluding here chapter 9, and I hope you all have a good day, and we will talk again soon.